Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get started with today's story. This is the story of Mark Davis, a young man living in a small college town in Texas. At 23, Mark was overwhelmed by the weight of his life. The streets were slick with rain as he trudged along the sidewalk, his backpack heavy on his shoulder, his face etched with worry. He was juggling his final year of law school, a part-time job at a cafe, and the mounting debts left by his late father. Everything felt like it was closing in on him, the pressure of it all building with each step he took. The world seemed to get colder and darker with each passing day. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He answered with a tired voice. Mark Davis speaking. A calm, authoritative voice on the other end responded, "This is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you. It's about your financial situation." Mark frowned, confused. "I'm sorry, who are you? How do you know about that?" Eleanor's voice was smooth, almost reassuring as she interrupted him, "I know enough. Let's meet at Brooks Bistro, 7 p.m. It's important." And just like that, the call ended. Mark stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He looked up at the darkening sky, the rain coming down harder now, and wondered if this was some kind of joke. Who was Eleanor Brooks? Why did she want to meet him? He made his way to the bistro, the rain soaking through his jacket as he arrived. Stepping inside, the warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the soft lighting created an inviting atmosphere, a stark contrast to the storm outside. Mark was greeted by a woman sitting at a corner table, her silver hair styled elegantly, her tailored suit exuding wealth and sophistication. She was Eleanor Brooks, and there was no mistaking her. Mark hesitated for a moment before sitting down, his mind racing with questions. Eleanor didn't waste time with small talk. She placed a thick manila envelope in front of him, the edges of the paper crisp and clean. "Mark," she said, her eyes fixed on him, "I know about the debts your father left behind. I know you're struggling to make ends meet. I'm here to offer you a solution." Mark's brows furrowed, his confusion deepening. What was she getting at? She leaned forward slightly, her tone turning serious. "I have an offer for you. A contract. If you agree, I'll pay off your debts, ensure your financial security, and in return, you'll marry me." Mark blinked, not sure if he'd heard her right. "Excuse me?" he asked, the words barely escaping his lips. "You heard me," she replied coolly. "This isn't about romance. It's a business arrangement. You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this. I need a husband, someone who will help solidify my legacy. I don't need love, Mark. I just need a companion." Mark's mind spun as he processed her words. A marriage of convenience? It sounded too absurd to be true. He stared at her, his thoughts racing. "Why me?" he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and skepticism. Eleanor's expression softened for the first time, though it was still controlled. "You're exactly what I need. You'll help me preserve my family's legacy. It's a fair trade." Mark leaned back in his chair, feeling a mix of anger and curiosity rise within him. He didn't know what to make of her offer, but in that moment, it felt like the only way out of his financial nightmare. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I need some time to think about this," he said, his voice shaking slightly as he turned to leave. Eleanor didn't try to stop him. Instead, she simply nodded, her calm demeanor never wavering. "Take all the time you need, Mark. But don't take too long. The offer won't last forever." Mark stepped back into the rain, the cool droplets hitting his face, but he barely felt them. His mind was racing with thoughts of the strange proposal he had just been given. Could he really marry a woman he didn't even know for the sake of money? Was this his only chance to escape the crushing weight of debt? As he walked down the street, he couldn't help but feel like he was walking into something much bigger than himself. As Mark walked down the rain-soaked streets, his thoughts were racing. Eleanor's offer echoed in his mind, her words repeated in an endless loop, "Marry me, and I'll take care of everything." He couldn't help but feel a strange mix of disbelief and curiosity. Was this really happening? Was he really considering this? His heart pounded in his chest as he made his way home. It was a quiet walk, the sound of raindrops tapping against the pavement the only noise filling the air. When he reached his small apartment, he stepped inside, throwing his damp jacket onto the couch. The apartment felt emptier than usual, the silence overwhelming. The weight of the decision loomed over him, heavier than the debts he had been struggling with for so long. He dropped onto the couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. The phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the stillness. He glanced at it. It was a message from his mother. "Mark, have you thought about the debt? You need to do something before it gets worse." He let out a sigh and dropped his head into his hands. The pressure was building, and he was running out of time. Could he really marry a stranger for the sake of money? Could he live with himself knowing it wasn't real? He had always dreamed of something more, something meaningful. But right now, he was desperate. The next morning, Mark found himself at the bistro once again, standing outside the door, unsure of what he was walking into. He had spent hours the night before thinking it through, and now, here he was, about to meet Eleanor again. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The warmth of the bistro washed over him, the cozy atmosphere doing little to calm his nerves. Eleanor was already sitting at their table, her silver hair catching the light as she looked up at him. She smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that reassured him. It was the kind of smile that said, "I know what you're thinking, and I have all the answers." "Mark," she said, her voice as calm and composed as always, "I'm glad you came. I know you've been thinking about my proposal. I'm sure it's a lot to take in. But let's not waste time. You need this. And I need you." She slid a folder across the table to him. "Here are the details. If you agree, I'll take care of everything. Your debts, your future, you'll have everything you need." Mark picked up the folder, flipping through the pages filled with legal jargon, contracts, and numbers that meant very little to him. His eyes scanned the document, but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't just thinking about the money or the debts, he was thinking about his life, his future, and what this deal meant for him. What would it mean to give up his independence? What would it mean to live a life that wasn't his own? He looked up at Eleanor, who was watching him with a calculating gaze, waiting for him to make his decision. "What if I want more than just money?" he asked quietly. Eleanor's smile softened for a moment, but only slightly. "You will get more, Mark. The money is just the beginning. With me, you'll have opportunities, you'll have security, and most importantly, you'll have a chance to live a life that matters. This is a partnership, not just a contract." Her voice was firm, but there was an underlying sincerity in it. It was enough to make him hesitate, enough to make him question everything he thought he knew. Mark set the folder down, his fingers trembling slightly. He was torn between the desperate need to secure his future and the fear of losing himself in the process. "I'll need some time to think about it," he said, his voice tight. Eleanor nodded, her eyes not leaving his. "Take all the time you need," she said. "But remember, time is something you're running out of." With that, she stood up, leaving him alone with the decision he had to make. Mark sat there for a long moment, the weight of the choice pressing down on him. He had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same. As he left the bistro, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this was the turning point in his life. Whatever decision he made, it would change everything. He wasn't sure if he was ready for it, but deep down, he knew that it was the only option he had left. Mark walked the streets in a daze, his thoughts clouded by the decision that lay before him. It had been 2 days since he last met Eleanor at the bistro, and though he had told her he needed time to think, the weight of the situation was pressing in on him. The rain had stopped, but the heaviness in his chest remained. His life was at a crossroads, and he was caught between the promises of security and the risk of losing everything he believed in. He reached his apartment, the door creaking as he entered. The silence greeted him, as it always did. He walked into the living room, his eyes drifting over the clutter of his small space. The place was a reflection of his life, disorganized, chaotic, and always on the edge of falling apart. His phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. It was another reminder from his mother, a message urging him to make a decision. "You don't have much time left, Mark. We can't keep going like this." Mark sat down on the couch, his fingers running through his hair as he stared at the screen. His mind was made up. The decision was inevitable. He knew deep down that this offer from Eleanor, however strange, was his only way out of the hole he had dug for himself. The debts, the uncertainty of his future, all of it had become too much to bear. A fake marriage for financial stability? It seemed like the best option, though it felt wrong on every level. He took a deep breath and picked up his phone, dialing the number he knew all too well. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity, and finally, Eleanor's voice answered. "Mark," she said, her tone steady as always, "I was wondering when you'd call." "I've made my decision," Mark said, his voice firm but laced with uncertainty. "I'll do it. I'll marry you." There was a brief pause on the other end, and Mark could almost hear the smile in her voice when she spoke again. "I knew you'd come to the right conclusion. I'll have my lawyer prepare the papers. We'll meet tomorrow to finalize everything." Mark hung up the phone, a strange mix of relief and dread washing over him. He had made the choice, but the reality of it hit him like a wave. A fake marriage. A partnership born out of necessity, not love. He couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something new or the end of everything he had ever known. The next day, he arrived at Eleanor's office. The building was a towering symbol of wealth and power, a stark contrast to the small apartment he called home. He stepped inside, greeted by a sleek, modern lobby that felt almost cold in its perfection. A receptionist led him to a conference room, where Eleanor was already waiting. "Mark, I'm glad you could make it," she said, standing as he entered. Her silver hair gleamed in the bright lights of the room, and her sharp, professional demeanor made him feel small in comparison. "Let's get this over with," Mark replied, trying to mask the anxiety that was creeping up inside him. He sat down across from her, and she pushed a thick stack of papers toward him. "This is the contract. Sign here, and you'll officially be my husband." Mark stared at the papers, his fingers hovering over the pen. Everything seemed surreal. He had never imagined his life would come to this, signing a contract to marry a woman he barely knew, all for the sake of money. But the alternative was worse. The crushing weight of his debt, the pressure to succeed, the fear of losing everything. This was his escape. He signed the papers with a shaky hand, the sound of the pen on the paper louder than he expected. Eleanor looked at him with a satisfied smile. "Congratulations, Mark. You've just secured your future." As Mark stood to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just changed in his life. He had made the decision to marry Eleanor, but what did that really mean? Was he truly free, or had he just sold a part of himself in the process? He didn't know the answers yet, but he had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger journey. And as he stepped out of the building, he couldn't help but wonder if the man he was now, the man who had agreed to this arrangement, was the same man who had walked in just hours before. Mark could hardly believe what had just happened. He had signed the papers, agreed to marry Eleanor, and yet it felt surreal. As he walked out of the building, the bright lights of the city seemed almost blinding, as if everything around him was moving too fast, too suddenly. The weight of the contract in his pocket felt heavier with every step. He hadn't expected things to happen this quickly. He had imagined some time to adjust, some moment to breathe before diving headfirst into this new life. But now, everything was set in motion. That evening, he found himself sitting alone in his small apartment, the quiet of the room pressing in on him. The phone rang once again, breaking the silence. He glanced at it. It was a message from Eleanor, confirming their first public appearance together as husband and wife at a business gala. The thought of it made his stomach churn. He had agreed to marry her, but the reality of the situation, the cameras, the media, the fake smiles, was starting to hit him in full force. The next day, Mark stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie, a feeling of dread swirling in his chest. He was supposed to be Eleanor's husband now, in front of the world. He couldn't shake the thought that he was stepping into a role he wasn't ready for. As he prepared for the gala, he couldn't help but think about his mother's words the day before. "You're really going through with this, Mark?" she had asked, her voice laced with concern. "This isn't you. Don't let her take away who you really are." But Mark hadn't known what else to do. The debts, the endless struggle to survive, it was all too much. When he arrived at the venue, the gala was already in full swing. The lights were dazzling, the music lively, and the room was filled with elegantly dressed guests, mingling and chatting, their voices a low hum in the background. Mark stood at the entrance, feeling out of place, as if he didn't belong here. He was just a law student, a man with a mountain of debt, and yet here he was, in a tuxedo, preparing to walk into a world that felt like it was miles away from the life he had known. As he entered the ballroom, Eleanor appeared at his side, her presence commanding the room. She was everything he had imagined, poised, confident, and completely at ease in her surroundings. Mark, on the other hand, felt like an outsider. He had never been to a gala like this before. The bright lights, the cameras flashing, the whispers of people around them, it was all overwhelming. He couldn't help but feel that everyone was watching him, judging him, wondering who he really was. Eleanor smiled at him, as if sensing his discomfort. "Just follow my lead," she whispered, her hand lightly resting on his arm. "You'll be fine." Mark nodded, forcing a smile. He was here now, and there was no turning back. He had made his choice, and this was the consequence of that decision. As they walked through the crowd, the weight of the evening began to sink in. The grand ballroom, the luxury, the expectations, all of it was for a marriage that wasn't real. During the event, Mark kept his distance, standing quietly by Eleanor's side as she networked with business partners and influential guests. He tried to blend in, not wanting to draw attention to himself. But he could feel the eyes on him, the whispers about the mysterious man who had just married the powerful Eleanor Brooks. They were probably all wondering the same thing: who was this man? What did he really want? As the night wore on, Mark found himself growing more uncomfortable. He was supposed to be enjoying this, celebrating his new life, but instead, he felt a deep sense of loneliness. Surrounded by people, yet feeling completely isolated. Eleanor seemed to be thriving in her element, but Mark was stuck in the role he had agreed to play. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was slowly losing himself. Finally, as the event began to wind down, Eleanor pulled him aside. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft. Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and confusion. "I don't know, Eleanor," he admitted. "This is all moving so fast. I feel like I'm drowning." She studied him for a moment, then gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "I know this isn't easy," she said, her voice tinged with sincerity. "But we're in this together now. You're not alone. We'll make it work. Trust me." Her words, though reassuring, didn't completely erase the doubts that were beginning to creep into his mind. As they left the gala, Mark couldn't help but feel conflicted. The life he had just entered was nothing like he had imagined. The wealth, the status, the facadite all seemed so far removed from the person he used to be. He had agreed to this arrangement for financial security, but now he was questioning whether the price was too high. Could he really continue to live in this world, trapped in a marriage that wasn't real? Was he willing to lose himself in the process? He didn't have the answers, but as he walked beside Eleanor, the future seemed uncertain, and the weight of the decision he had made felt heavier than ever. The next few days passed in a blur for Mark. He found himself caught between his old life and the one he had agreed to start. Every morning, he would wake up in his small apartment, the reality of his decision pressing on him. He had made the choice to marry Eleanor, to step into a world that was foreign to him, and now, he was beginning to wonder if it was all worth it. The weight of the contract in his pocket felt heavier each day, a constant reminder of what he had agreed to. His mind kept returning to that moment at the gala, the way he had felt so out of place, so disconnected from the life that was unfolding around him. One evening, Eleanor called him again, her voice calm and confident as always. "Mark, I have a dinner planned for us with some of the key investors. I need you to come with me. It's important for our image." The words were familiar, almost like a script he had memorized, but this time, they felt different. Eleanor had been asking more of him lately, attending events, making public appearances, all to strengthen the illusion of their perfect marriage. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the act. He agreed to go, knowing that the pressure was mounting. When he arrived at the restaurant, it was a lavish affair: high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and the soft hum of elegant conversation. The guests were well-dressed, businessmen and women who spoke in terms of deals and investments. Mark stood beside Eleanor, feeling like a fish out of water. As she moved through the room, greeting people with ease, Mark felt himself shrink back into the shadows. He wasn't a part of this world, and the more he tried to fit in, the more he felt like an outsider. Throughout the evening, Eleanor was the center of attention, her charm effortlessly winning over everyone around her. Mark stood quietly by her side, nodding politely when spoken to, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was slowly losing himself in this charade. The man who had entered this arrangement so desperately seeking financial security now found himself questioning the cost of that security. Was it worth losing who he was? Later that night, as the dinner began to wind down, Eleanor pulled him aside. Her expression was unreadable, her sharp eyes watching him intently. "Mark, you've been distant lately. Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice low and measured. He hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He couldn't tell her the truth, that he felt suffocated by the life he had stepped into, that he felt like a prisoner in a gilded cage. He was supposed to be grateful for the opportunity she had given him, but all he could feel was uncertainty. "I'm fine," he said, forcing a smile. "Just a little tired, I guess." Eleanor didn't seem convinced, but she didn't press him further. Instead, she reached out and gently touched his arm. "You need to understand, Mark. This is the life we're building. It's bigger than both of us. You've got to embrace it." Her words were meant to reassure him, but they only made him feel more trapped. He had agreed to marry her, to help her secure her legacy, but he hadn't signed up for this constant pressure, for the constant performance. The night ended with a round of handshakes and pleasantries, and Mark found himself walking back to the car with Eleanor in silence. As they drove home, the city lights flashing by, he couldn't help but feel the distance between them grow. Eleanor seemed so sure of everything, of her plans, her future, her world. But Mark was lost, caught between two lives, two identities. He had married her for financial stability, for a chance to escape his past, but now he wondered if he had traded one set of chains for another. When they arrived at their apartment, Eleanor was the first to get out of the car, her heels clicking on the pavement as she walked toward the building. Mark followed her, his mind still swirling with questions. They entered the apartment, and as the door closed behind them, Eleanor turned to him. "I hope you're starting to see the bigger picture, Mark," she said, her voice soft but firm. "This isn't just about us. It's about everything we can build together." Mark nodded, but deep down, he knew that the bigger picture she spoke of wasn't something he had signed up for. His life, his dreams, his identity, they were all slipping further and further away. As Eleanor walked toward the bedroom, Mark stood in the living room, staring at the door, lost in his thoughts. He had made a decision, but now, he was beginning to wonder if he had made the right one. The future that lay ahead seemed uncertain, and he couldn't help but feel like he was losing himself in the process. Mark woke up to the soft hum of the city outside his window, but this morning felt different. The weight of the previous nights, the gala, the fake smiles, the loneliness lingered in his mind. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, but this time, something felt off. He wasn't sure if it was the life he had agreed to or the version of himself he had lost along the way. He was no longer just a man in debt, a man desperate for a way out. He was now a husband, but not in the way he had ever imagined. Eleanor's world, with all its expectations and demands, was beginning to feel like a cage, and Mark wasn't sure how much longer he could pretend it didn't bother him. The tension between them had been growing for days. Eleanor, ever the confident and composed woman, seemed oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. She had a way of making everything seem effortless, as if she were always in control, while Mark felt like he was drowning in this new reality. Her smile, her calm demeanor, they were all part of a persona that he had come to resent, and yet, he couldn't find a way to break free. He had married her for financial stability, yes, but he hadn't expected to lose himself in the process. Today, they were supposed to attend another even important business meeting with high-profile clients, but as Mark stood there, ready to leave, he found himself hesitating. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Eleanor. "We need to look perfect today, Mark. Remember, it's all about appearances. Let's make sure we show them how powerful we are together." He stared at the message for a moment, feeling the emptiness behind her words. It was as if their marriage had become nothing more than a performance, a show for the world to see. Mark took a deep breath and headed out the door. The drive to the meeting was quiet, too quiet. Eleanor, sitting beside him, was lost in her thoughts, tapping away on her phone. He glanced at her, trying to read her face, but there was nothing there. She was a mystery to him now, a woman he barely knew, yet one he was supposed to share his life with. His mind drifted back to the previous night, when she had told him, "We're building something bigger than us, Mark. This is just the beginning." But for Mark, it felt like the beginning of an end, not a new chapter. When they arrived at the venue, the same familiar feeling of inadequacy washed over him. The elegant hotel lobby, the perfectly dressed guests, the shiny floors, all of it felt like a world that was out of reach. He stood at Eleanor's side, his role once again as the silent observer, the man who didn't quite belong. The business leaders, the investors, they all looked at him as if he were a mystery, trying to figure out who he really was. He wanted to tell them the truth, that he was just a man trying to survive, but the words stuck in his throat. Eleanor, as usual, was in her element. She moved through the crowd with ease, exchanging pleasantries and making deals. Mark stood by her, a shadow to her light, his thoughts a whirlwind. He watched her, almost fascinated by her ability to command attention, to control the room. But that fascination was fading, replaced by a sense of dread. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but he had started to resent her, or at least the version of her that he was seeing now, the woman who seemed more interested in power than in their marriage. As the meeting continued, Mark grew more uncomfortable. He excused himself from the table and stepped out into the hallway, needing a moment to breathe. The air felt thick with the weight of expectations. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to calm the chaos in his mind. How had he gotten here? Was this the life he had imagined? A part of him had always known that marrying Eleanor would change things, but he hadn't realized just how much he would lose in the process. After a few minutes, Eleanor came looking for him, her heels clicking on the floor as she approached. "You okay?" she asked, her voice sharp with concern, but there was no warmth in it. Mark nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just needed a minute." She didn't seem convinced, but she didn't press further. Instead, she reached for his arm, leading him back into the room. "Let's get back to work. We're a team, Mark. We need to show them that." Mark followed her back to the table, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "We're a team," she had said. But it didn't feel like they were a team. It felt like she was building something he wasn't a part of. As he sat back down, he realized he had become a pawn in her game, a man whose worth was measured by his ability to play the part, not by who he truly was. As the meeting wrapped up, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of small talk and handshakes, but inside, Mark felt like he was losing himself more and more with each passing minute. Eleanor was everything he wasn't, and the more he tried to keep up, the more he felt like a stranger in his own life. As they left the venue, Eleanor spoke to him briefly, but Mark barely heard her. His mind was too far away, lost in the overwhelming sense of being stuck. The life they were building, the facade they were living in, it was all starting to feel hollow, and Mark didn't know how much longer he could continue pretending. When they arrived back at their apartment, Eleanor immediately retreated to her study, leaving Mark alone in the living room. He sat there, the silence pressing down on him, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his decision. He had agreed to this life, but now, he was beginning to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. Mark sat in the silence of their apartment, the weight of his thoughts pressing heavily on his chest. Eleanor had retreated into her study, leaving him alone with the mess of emotions he had been pushing down for weeks. He glanced around the room, taking in the expensive furniture, the carefully chosen decor, the life that they had built together. On the outside, it looked perfect, but inside, Mark felt more lost than ever. He had agreed to this marriage, to this life, but every day he felt further away from the man he once was. He stood up, pacing the room, his mind spinning with thoughts of what he had given up and what he had gained. He had married Eleanor for financial security, to escape the crushing debt and uncertainty of his past. But now, as he looked around at the life she had given him, he realized that security came with a cost. The more he tried to fit into this world, the more it seemed to swallow him whole. He had become a puppet, his strings pulled by the woman he had once admired. He had built his life around her vision of success, but now he wondered if he was truly living, or if he was simply existing. Mark's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Eleanor's voice from the doorway. "Mark, we need to talk." He turned to face her, his heart sinking as she stepped into the living room. She looked as poised and composed as ever, but there was something in her eyes, something that told him this conversation was going to be different. "What's going on, Mark?" Eleanor asked, her tone softer than usual. "You've been distant lately. I can feel it. Is this marriage starting to feel too much for you?" Mark swallowed hard, the words getting caught in his throat. He had been avoiding this conversation for so long, afraid of what would happen if he spoke the truth. But now, standing before Eleanor, he realized he couldn't keep pretending anymore. The weight of everything he had been holding back was too much. "Eleanor, I don't know if I can keep doing this," he finally said, his voice low. "I agreed to this marriage because I thought it was the only way out, but now I feel like I'm losing myself. I don't even know who I am anymore." Eleanor's expression remained unchanged, though there was a flicker of something surprise, maybe, or concern in her eyes. She stepped forward, her hands folding together as she took a deep breath. "Mark, I understand this isn't easy," she said, her voice calm. "But you need to understand that everything I've done, everything we've built, is for our future. You've made a commitment to me, to us, and that's not something we can just walk away from." Mark shook his head, frustration bubbling up inside him. "It's not just about the commitment, Eleanor. It's about who I'm becoming in the process. I don't want to be a part of this world, a world where everything is about appearances, about power and control. I need more than that." There was a pause, and for a moment, it seemed like Eleanor was considering his words. But then, her face hardened, the calm mask she wore slipping back into place. "Mark, you knew what you were getting into when we started this," she said, her tone sharp. "This is how the world works. You can either accept it and move forward with me, or you can walk away and lose everything." Mark's heart sank at her words. The ultimatum was clear, and he felt cornered. He had hoped that, deep down, Eleanor would understand, that she would see the turmoil he was going through. But now, it seemed that she was more interested in preserving the image of their life than in understanding his pain. "I don't want to lose everything, Eleanor," Mark said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet desperation, "but I don't know if I can keep living like this." Eleanor took a step back, crossing her arms over her chest. "Then you need to make a choice, Mark," she said firmly. "This is the life we're building. If you can't accept it, then maybe we're not meant to be together." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Mark stood there, feeling the weight of the decision that lay before him. He had already given up so much, but now he was being asked to choose between his own happiness and the life he had agreed to build with Eleanor. As Eleanor turned to walk back to her study, Mark stood frozen in the middle of the room, his mind racing. This was the moment he had feared. He could feel his old life slipping away, and he was left standing in the ruins of the man he used to be. He had a choice to make, but he wasn't sure he was ready to face it. Mark stood there, feeling the weight of Eleanor's words hanging in the air like a cloud he couldn't shake off. She had given him an ultimatum: accept the life she had planned, or walk away. But the truth was, he wasn't sure if he could continue living this lie. Every day he spent in this marriage, in this world, he felt like a part of him was slipping away, like he was fading into someone he didn't recognize. He had hoped that, with time, things would get easier, that maybe the life Eleanor had promised him would bring him peace. But it wasn't happening. Instead, he was more lost than ever. He stood by the window, staring out at the city, but his thoughts were far away. He thought about his father, the man who had always dreamed of more for him, more than debt, more than struggle. Mark had promised himself that he would build a better life, that he wouldn't end up like the man who had worked himself to the bone and left him with nothing. But now, as he looked at the life he had built with Eleanor, he wasn't sure he had achieved anything at all. The money, the power, the prestige, none of it mattered if it meant losing who he was. A few hours passed, and Mark finally made up his mind. He needed to talk to Eleanor. The thought of confronting her, of finally telling her the truth about how he was feeling, terrified him. But he couldn't keep going like this. He couldn't live another day pretending everything was fine when he knew it wasn't. He walked toward her study, his heart pounding with every step. The door was slightly ajar, and he hesitated for a moment before knocking softly. Eleanor looked up from her desk, her eyes immediately narrowing as she saw him standing in the doorway. "Mark," she said, her voice cool. "I didn't expect you to come in here." "What is it?" Mark swallowed hard, his nerves getting the best of him. He had rehearsed this conversation in his head 1,000 times, but now that the moment had arrived, the words didn't come as easily as he had hoped. "Eleanor, we need to talk," he said finally, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep living like this, pretending everything is okay, when it's not." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by his sudden outburst. "What are you talking about?" she asked, leaning back in her chair. "You knew what you were signing up for, Mark. We've been through this." Mark shook his head, feeling the frustration building inside him. "I didn't know. I didn't know how it would feel. I didn't know how much of myself I would lose in this. I thought this marriage would give me stability, a way out of the mess I was in, but now it feels like a prison. I'm not happy, Eleanor. And I don't think I can keep living like this." There was a long pause as Eleanor stared at him, her expression unreadable. Mark's heart raced as he waited for her response, unsure of what she would say, what would happen next. Finally, Eleanor stood up, her gaze hardening. "Mark, this isn't a game. You don't get to just walk away because things aren't easy. I've given you everything: security, opportunity. You asked for this, and now you're going to back out?" Mark took a deep breath, his voice breaking as he spoke. "I never asked for this life, Eleanor. I asked for a chance to build something real, something meaningful. I never wanted to be trapped in a marriage that was nothing but a contract. I wanted a future where I could be myself, where I didn't feel like I was losing everything that mattered." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words, and for the first time since they had met, Mark saw a flicker of something in her eyes, something that looked like regret, or maybe sadness. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by her usual mask of control. "I did what I thought was best for both of us," she said quietly, her voice softening slightly. "But if you can't see that, if you can't accept what this marriage is, then maybe you're right. Maybe it's time for us to go our separate ways." The words hit him harder than he expected. He had known this moment would come, but hearing it from her felt like a punch to the gut. He thought he would feel relief, but instead, he felt a deep ache in his chest. Maybe this was the right decision, but it still hurt. Mark stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of everything crashing down on him. He had come here to find clarity, but now he felt more uncertain than ever. I think we need some time apart, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor nodded, her face a mask of indifference. Fine, she said simply. Take the time you need. As Mark turned to leave, he felt the finality of her words hit him like a wave. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: this was the end of something, the end of a life he thought he wanted. And now, he was faced with the daunting task of figuring out who he really was and what he truly wanted. Mark left the room, the weight of the conversation still pressing down on him. He stepped out into the quiet hallway, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. Eleanor's words echoed in his head, maybe it's time for us to go our separate ways. He had never imagined it would come to this. For the past few months, he had been living in a world of appearances, a world that felt like it was slowly suffocating him. But now, the reality of that world seemed too much to ignore. He walked slowly down the hallway, unsure of where to go or what to do next. He had made a decision to be free, but the freedom felt strange, almost terrifying. The weight of his past, the debts, the struggles, they hadn't disappeared. They still loomed over him, but now there was also the uncertainty of what came next. Was he really making the right choice? Was walking away from Eleanor the answer? He stepped out into the cold night air, the chill biting at his skin. The city lights shimmered in the distance, but they no longer seemed as bright, no longer seemed to promise the future he had once imagined. Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Eleanor: "We'll talk later, when you're ready." The words hit him harder than he expected, and he found himself staring at the screen, unsure of how to respond. Mark found a nearby bench and sat down, letting the silence wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to think. He thought about his father, about the dreams he had once had for a better life, a life where he didn't feel trapped by his circumstances. And now, here he was, standing at a crossroads. He had the chance to start over, but at what cost? He pulled his jacket tighter around him as a cold gust of wind blew through the street. The reality of the decision he had made began to sink in. Eleanor had been right in one way, had made a commitment to her, to the life they had built. But what about his own life? What about his own happiness? Had he sacrificed his future for a life he didn't want? Mark stood up and started walking again, each step bringing him closer to an uncertain future. He didn't know where he was going, but for the first time in months, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. He had chosen to take control of his life, to make a change. It was scary, yes, but it was also liberating. As he walked, he realized that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, moments of doubt. But there would also be new opportunities, new chances to define who he really was. Mark didn't have all the answers yet, but he was ready to find them. He had spent so much time living in the shadows of others, but now it was time to step into the light, to find his own path. When Mark finally reached his apartment, he stood at the door for a moment, the key in his hand. He had chosen to walk away from the life he had built with Eleanor, but it wasn't just about leaving her. It was about leaving behind the fear, the doubt, and the suffocating need to please others. He wasn't perfect, and his future was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt a sense of peace. Mark opened the door, stepping inside and closing it quietly behind him. The apartment felt different, quieter somehow. It wasn't the life he had imagined, but it was his. And that, in the end, was enough.